The storm came without warning that night, swallowing the city in sheets of rain so thick the streetlights blurred into halos of dying gold. Inside the private wing of St. Vincent's Hospital, where the wealthy bought silence and discretion along with their care, Alessandro De Luca stood like a statue carved from grief. His hands, which had broken bones and signed death warrants without trembling, now shook as they gripped the cold metal railing outside the ICU. Through the glass his daughter lay small and still beneath a tangle of wires and tubes, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision that mocked the absence of life in her eyes. The doctors had run out of words 3 days ago. Now they only offered him their shoulders to lean on, their empty reassurances that they were doing everything possible. But Alessandro knew the language of failure. He'd seen it in the eyes of men who begged for mercy, and now he saw it in the faces of these physicians who wore their white coats like armor against the truth. His little Lucia, only 7 years old, was slipping away from him, and all his power, all his money, all the fear his name commanded in the underground, none of it could pull her back from whatever dark place she'd wandered into. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the windows in their frames. Down the corridor, past the restricted access signs and the security checkpoint no one dared cross without permission, a young woman pushed a cleaning cart with wheels that squeaked against the polished floor. Mira had worked at St. Vincent's for 8 months, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, invisible to everyone except the mess she was hired to erase. Her uniform hung loose on her thin frame, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid that had seen better days. She'd learned to move quietly, to keep her eyes down, to exist in the spaces between notice and dismissal. But tonight, something made her pause. Through the heavy doors that separated the private wing from the rest of the hospital, she heard it. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. A child's cry, weak and desperate, cutting through the hum of machinery and the whisper of hushed conversations. Mira's hand tightened on the mop handle. She knew these doors were forbidden. She knew what happened to people who forgot their place in the carefully maintained hierarchy of this building. Yet her feet moved anyway, drawn by an instinct older than fear, a pull she couldn't name or resist. The security guard had stepped away for a smoke break, his post abandoned in a moment of carelessness that would later haunt him. Mira slipped through the door like a shadow, her heart hammering against her ribs as she moved down the hallway toward the light spilling from the ICU observation window. She pressed herself against the wall, peering through the glass at the scene inside. The little girl lay motionless, her dark hair fanned across the pillow like spilled ink, her skin pale as moonlight. Machines beeped and whirred around her, measuring a life that seemed to be measured in borrowed seconds. And standing there, his back to the world, was a man whose shoulders carried the weight of an empire built on blood and loyalty. Mira had never seen Alessandro De Luca in person, but she recognized the shape of power in the way he stood, the way even the doctors kept their distance, circling him like satellites afraid to drift too close to the sun. She should have turned back, should have returned to her cart and her mop and the safety of invisibility, but the child cried out again, a sound so small and broken it pierced something deep in Mira's chest, something that had nothing to do with logic or self-preservation. Before she understood what she was doing, Mira's hand was on the door handle. The latch clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed space. Every head in the room turned toward her, the doctors, the nurses, the man whose eyes held the kind of darkness that swallowed light. But Mira didn't see them. She saw only the child, and she moved forward with the inevitability of rain falling toward the earth. Her feet carried her to the bedside, past the expensive equipment and the Roman IV stands, past the gasp of shock from a nurse who reached out too late to stop her. Mira's hand, rough from years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, trembled as she reached toward the girl's forehead. She expected someone to grab her, to drag her away, to punish her for this unforgivable intrusion. But in that moment, suspended between heartbeats, the room held its breath. and when her palm made contact with the child's burning skin, something shifted in the air itself. The heart monitor, which had been stuttering its irregular rhythm like a broken clock, suddenly steadied. The frantic beeping slowed, deepened, found a pattern that made the lead doctor's mouth fall open in disbelief. Color began to seep back into Lucia's cheeks, like dawn breaking across pale winter sky. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the first time in 72 hours, she took a breath that wasn't forced by machinery, a real breath, deep and full and entirely her own. The doctors surged forward, checking monitors, recalibrating equipment, speaking in rapid medical terminology that couldn't explain what their instruments were telling them. But Mira barely heard them. She felt it, a warmth flowing from somewhere deep inside her, through her arm, into the child whose small hand had instinctively reached up to grasp hers. It wasn't magic. It wasn't science. It was something older than both, something that lived in the space between intention and miracle, where love becomes tangible enough to heal. Alessandro moved like thunder given human form, crossing the room in 3 strides that made the floor seem to shake. His hand closed around Mira's wrist with crushing force, and when she looked up into his face, she saw murder written there in bold letters. His voice, when it came, was low and lethal. "Who are you? Who sent you here?" But before Mira could answer, before the fear could even fully register in her mind, Lucia's voice, soft as silk, precious as rain after drought, whispered a single word, warm. The child's eyes opened fully, focusing on Mira with clarity that made the doctors gasp. "Mama, she's warm." She made the cold go away. Alessandro's grip on Mira's wrist loosened. His expression shifted through a dozen emotions too quickly to name. Rage, confusion, wonder, and something that might have been the beginning of belief. He looked at his daughter, truly alive for the first time in days, then back at the poor cleaning girl whose touch had accomplished what all his money and all their expertise could not. The lead physician, a man who'd trained at Johns Hopkins and published papers in prestigious journals, stood frozen with his tablet hanging uselessly at his side. There's no medical explanation for this. Her vitals were critical 3 minutes ago. This kind of recovery doesn't happen. It can't happen. But it had happened. Everyone in that room had witnessed it, and the evidence pulsed steadily on every monitor, undeniable as sunrise. Alessandro released Mira's wrist and took a step back, his dark eyes never leaving her face. She was nothing, a cleaner, a nobody, dressed in a stained uniform that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Yet she had walked into his world and broken the laws of everything he understood about power and control. His daughter, his only light in a life consumed by shadows, had been returned to him by hands that had spent the day scrubbing toilets and mopping floors. The irony wasn't lost on him, and neither was the debt. In Alessandro's world, debts were the currency that mattered most, and this one was beyond calculation. "Take her to the car," he said to his bodyguard, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that turned suggestions into inevitability. "Take her to the house." Mira finally found her voice, small and shaking. "Please, I just wanted to help. I didn't mean to, you helped." Alessandro interrupted, and something in his tone had shifted, like ice beginning to crack under unexpected pressure. "Now you come with me, not a request." The doctors protested, insisting that Lucia needed to stay for observation, that they needed to run tests, that removing her from the hospital was dangerous. But Alessandro had already lifted his daughter from the bed, cradling her against his chest with a tenderness that seemed impossible from hands so familiar with violence. Lucia wrapped her arms around his neck and smiled, a real smile that lit up her pale face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "The girl comes too," she murmured against her father's shoulder. "She keeps the cold away." And so Mira, who had woken that morning expecting nothing more extraordinary than another shift of invisible labor, found herself escorted through the rain-soaked night toward a sleek black car that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned in her entire life. The DeLuca mansion rose from the hillside like something out of a dark fairy tale, all stone and iron gates and windows that glowed with warm light against the storm. Mira sat in the back seat, her wet clothes soaking into leather that was softer than any bed she'd ever slept in, watching the world she knew disappear behind her. The bodyguard driving the car hadn't spoken a word, and Alessandro, holding his sleeping daughter, stared out the window with an expression carved from granite. When they arrived, servants appeared from nowhere to open doors and offer umbrellas, their movements choreographed with the precision of people who'd learned that mistakes in this household carried consequences. Mira was ushered inside, through a grand foyer where her reflection looked small and out of place in the massive gilt-framed mirrors. The floors were marble, veined with gold like rivers of treasure running through stone. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across walls adorned with art she recognized from the museums she'd never been able to afford to enter. This was a world where money wasn't spent, it was displayed, weaponized, used to draw lines between those who belonged and those who never would. A housekeeper with severe features and suspicious eyes led Mira upstairs, past doors that probably opened into rooms larger than the apartment she shared with 3 other girls. They arrived at a suite that had been hastily prepared, a bed with silk sheets, a bathroom with fixtures that gleamed like jewelry, and a window that overlooked gardens still being lashed by rain. "Signor DeLuca wants you to stay here tonight," the housekeeper said, her tone suggesting she had opinions about this arrangement that she was barely restraining. "Someone will bring you clothes. Don't wander." Then she was gone, the door closing with a soft click that somehow sounded like a lock sliding home. Mira stood in the center of the room, dripping onto an antique rug that was probably worth more than she'd earn in a decade, and tried to make sense of what had just happened to her life. She'd touched a dying child, and somehow, impossibly, the child had lived. And now she was a prisoner, or a guest, or maybe something without a name, in the home of the most dangerous man in the city. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Mira lay in the two-soft bed, staring at shadows that played across the ceiling like spirits dancing, and wondered if she'd wake up back in her cramped apartment to discover this had all been a fever dream. But morning came with relentless reality, sunlight streaming through windows that had been cleaned by someone who probably earned more than she did. A knock at the door brought a young maid carrying clothes, simple but expensive in her size, as if Alessandro's staff were accustomed to conjuring solutions to impossible problems. Mira dressed and followed the maid downstairs, through corridors that seemed designed to remind visitors of their insignificance, until they reached a breakfast room where Lucia sat at a table that could have seated 20. The child looked up and smiled, and the bruises under her eyes had faded, replaced by a glow of health that seemed miraculous in the morning light. "You came," Lucia said, as if there had been any choice in the matter. "Papa said you would stay and make sure I don't get cold again." Mira opened her mouth to explain that she didn't understand what had happened, that she wasn't special, that she was just a girl who cleaned floors and shouldn't be here. But before she could speak, Alessandro entered the room, and the air itself seemed to shift in response to his presence. He looked different in daylight, still dangerous, still carved from power and certainty, but more human somehow. The vulnerability he'd shown at the hospital had been carefully locked away again, but Mira could see traces of it in the way his eyes lingered on his daughter, drinking in the sight of her alive and smiling. "Sit," he said to Mira, gesturing to the chair beside Lucia. It wasn't a request. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of observation from every servant who passed through the room. Alessandro watched her with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading people the way others read books, searching for tells and weaknesses and hidden agendas. "My daughter believes you saved her life," he said finally, his voice measured and careful. "The doctors have no explanation for her recovery, so I need you to tell me exactly what you did." Mira shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. I felt like she needed someone to touch her, to let her know she wasn't alone in the dark." Something flickered across Alessandro's face, sir. "Prize, maybe, or recognition. You felt it." "Not a question," Mira nodded, like she was drowning and needed someone to pull her back. "I know it sounds. My mother used to say the same thing." Alessandro interrupted, and for a moment his voice carried a softness that seemed impossible. "Before she died, she worked as a healer in our village. Said some people could feel the cold places where life was leaving, and if you were brave enough, you could reach in and bring the warmth back." The revelation hung in the air between them like a bridge being constructed from words. Lucia, oblivious to the tension, reached over and took Mira's hand. "See, Papa, I told you she was special." Alessandro's expression hardened again, the moment of vulnerability sealed away. "Special or not, you stay here until I understand what this is. My enemies would pay fortunes for someone who could do what you did. You're safer under my protection." It wasn't protection Mira heard in his words. It was possession. But she also heard the unspoken truth. She'd become valuable the moment she touched Lucia, and valuable things in Alessandro's world were never allowed to simply walk away. She was trapped in gold instead of iron, but trapped nonetheless. And so the days began to unfold in that strange mansion, where danger wore expensive suits, and kindness was a currency more rare than diamonds. Mira spent her mornings with Lucia, who clung to her like a lifeline, and her afternoons navigating the careful politics of a household where everyone had secrets and loyalties that shifted like shadows. But not everyone was pleased with Mira's presence. In the servants' quarters, jealousy festered like infection in a wound left untended. Elena, who had been Alessandro's most trusted housekeeper for 15 years, watched the poor cleaning girl receive treatment reserved for honored guests, and felt something dark twist in her chest. She'd dedicated her life to this family, had sacrificed everything to prove her loyalty, and now this nobody had walked in and stolen the spotlight with a single touch. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And worse, Alessandro's most ambitious lieutenant, Marco, saw opportunity in the disruption. He'd been positioning himself to take control of the family's operations, had built alliances and called in favors, and now this miracle girl threatened to remind Alessandro of things beyond power. Things like mercy and humanity that had no place in their world. Together, in whispered conversations hidden from the security cameras, Elena and Marco crafted a plan. If Lucia fell sick again, if the girl's supposed healing powers were proven false, then Alessandro would have no reason to keep her. And if they were careful, if they were clever, no one would ever know who'd tipped the first domino. The poison was subtle. Not enough to kill, just enough to make Lucia fade again, to bring back the cold that had nearly taken her before. Elena mixed it into the child's evening medicine 3 nights later, her hands steady with the certainty of someone who believed they were doing what was necessary. Lucia took the medicine without complaint, trusting as only children can trust, and settled into sleep while Mira read her stories about princesses and dragons and magic that seemed less impossible than it had a week ago. But in the deep hours of night, when the mansion held its breath between darkness and dawn, Lucia's breathing began to change. Mira, sleeping in the adjoining room at Alessandro's insistence, woke to a sound she'd learned to recognize, the sound of life trying to slip away. She rushed to Lucia's bedside and found the child pale again, her skin clammy, her pulse fluttering like a bird with broken wings. "No," Mira whispered, placing her hand on Lucia's forehead and trying to summon whatever force had flowed through her before. But this time, something was different. The cold wasn't natural. It tasted wrong, chemical, deliberate. Mira's eyes fell on the medicine bottle sitting on the nightstand, and understanding crashed over her like ice water. Someone had done this. Someone in this house of secrets and shadows had tried to hurt an innocent child to achieve some goal Mira couldn't begin to understand. She grabbed the bottle and ran for the door, but it was locked from the outside. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but the thick wood swallowed her voice. In the security room 3 floors below, Marco watched the monitors and smiled, adjusting the camera feeds to show empty hallways instead of Mira's desperate attempts at escape. By morning, the girl would be discredited. Lucia would recover on her own as the poison wore off, and everything could return to the order he'd been building toward. But he'd underestimated 2 things: Alessandro's paranoia and Mira's refusal to give up. While Mira continued fighting the locked door, Alessandro sat in his study reviewing security footage, as he did every night before sleep. It was a habit born from years of surviving in a world where trust was a luxury that got you killed. And there, in the recordings from earlier that evening, he saw Elena entering Lucia's room after the child had been put to bed, saw her hand lingering over the medicine bottle, saw the guilty glance toward the camera before she left. The rage that filled Alessandro in that moment was biblical in its intensity. He was moving before thought could catch up to action, his footsteps thunder in the silent mansion, his voice a roar that brought guards running from every direction. "Open that door, now!" The lock splintered under the force of shoulders hitting it in unison, and Alessandro burst into the room to find Mira cradling his daughter, tears streaming down her face, the medicine bottle clutched in her hand like evidence. "She's been poisoned," Mira gasped. "Someone poisoned her. I can feel it. It's not like before. It's wrong." Alessandro took the bottle, his mind already putting pieces together with the cold calculation of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading betrayal. He handed Lucia to Mira. "Keep her warm, don't stop touching her. Understand?" Mira nodded, and Alessandro left the room with violence written in every line of his body. What happened in the next hour would become legend in the underworld. The night Alessandro de Luca reminded everyone why his name inspired fear. He found Elena first, dragged the truth from her with methods he'd never wanted his daughter to know he was capable of. Then Marco, whose ambitions died in a basement room where mercy was just a word people used to describe weakness. By dawn, 2 bodies had been removed from the mansion through exits designed for exactly this purpose, and Alessandro returned to his daughter's room with blood on his knuckles and something broken in his eyes. Mira still sat on the bed, Lucia curled in her lap, breathing steadily now as whatever poison had been in her system was burned away by the relentless warmth of Mira's touch. Alessandro stood in the doorway, this man who controlled an empire built on fear and violence, and for the first time in decades he knelt, not to power, not to strategy, but to a poor girl whose only weapon was compassion, who had refused to let his daughter slip into darkness even when the world itself seemed determined to take her. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "Name your price, anything, it's yours." Mira looked at him, this dangerous man brought low by love for his child, and she understood something fundamental about the nature of power. It was nothing without purpose, nothing without something worth protecting. And in this moment, all of Alessandro's strength and cruelty and carefully constructed empire existed only to serve one small truth. His daughter was alive because a girl who had nothing had given everything. "I don't want your money," Mira said softly. "I don't want power or protection or a place in your world." Alessandro looked up, confusion crossing his features. "Then what?" "I want you to remember something," Mira continued, her hand never leaving Lucia's sleeping form. "Healing doesn't belong to the rich or the feared. It belongs to anyone brave enough to reach into the dark and pull someone back into the light. Your money didn't save her. Your power didn't save her. Love saved her. Connection saved her. the willingness to care about someone else's pain saved her. The words hit Alessandro like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the armor he'd worn for so long it had become his skin. He'd built his life on the principle that power was the only thing that mattered, that fear was the ultimate currency, that strength meant never showing weakness. But this girl, who had every reason to hate him for trapping her in his world, who'd nearly been killed because of his enemies, was teaching him something he'd forgotten in the years since his mother's death. That sometimes the greatest strength was the willingness to be gentle. Sometimes the greatest power was the courage to care. "Then what do you want me to do?" Alessandro asked, and it was perhaps the first time in 20 years he'd asked anyone that question without it being a threat. "Let me go," Mira said simply. "Let me go back to my life, and promise me you'll remember what saved your daughter today. Not revenge, not violence, just one person refusing to let another person face the darkness alone." Alessandro stood slowly, his knees aching from the unfamiliar position of supplication. Everything in him rebelled against the idea of letting her walk away. She was valuable beyond measure, and in his world, valuable things were kept locked away where others couldn't steal them. But as he looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, he understood that keeping Mira here would destroy the very thing that made her able to heal. You couldn't cage light without turning it into shadow. You couldn't imprison compassion without transforming it into resentment. She had saved Lucia not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. And that choice, freely made, was the source of her power. "You can leave," he said, and the words felt like tearing out part of his own heart. "But the clinics in the East District, the ones where people like you go when they can't afford real hospitals, they're mine now. I'll fund them, staff them properly, make sure people don't have to die just because they're poor." Mira's eyes widened. "Why would you?" "Because my daughter's life is worth no more than anyone else's." Alessandro interrupted, and he almost laughed at the revolutionary nature of the statement. "And if you taught me anything, it's that the measure of power isn't how much you can take. It's what you choose to do with what you have." Lucia stirred then, her eyes opening to focus on Mira's face. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. Mira smoothed the child's hair back with infinite gentleness. "I have to, sweetheart, but you're going to be fine now. The cold is gone, and your papa is going to make sure lots of other people get help when they need it too." "Because of you," Lucia said, and it wasn't a question. "Because of you, Papa's going to be different, I can tell." The child's intuition was sharper than any adult analysis. Alessandro knew that his daughter was right. Something fundamental had shifted in him, a tectonic movement in the foundation of who he was. He would still be dangerous, would still protect his family with lethal efficiency. But maybe, just maybe, he could be something else too. Mira left the mansion that morning in clothes she'd been given, with enough money in her pocket to keep her fed for a few months, whether she wanted it or not. Alessandro's driver took her back to her apartment, where her roommates bombarded her with questions about where she'd been that she couldn't begin to answer. Life settled back into familiar patterns, waking early, working hard, surviving. But the story of what had happened spread through the underworld like fire through dry grass. The girl who'd healed the Mafia boss's daughter with a touch. The nobody who'd walked into Alessandro De Luca's fortress and walked out again with her life and her freedom. Some said it was a fairy tale, others said it was a warning, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something had changed in the city, in the balance of power and mercy, and it had changed because one person had been brave enough to care. Months passed, and the seasons turned. In the East District, where people had always faced their illnesses with the quiet resignation of those who knew the world didn't care about their suffering, new clinics appeared with clean equipment and skilled doctors who worked for salaries that Alessandro paid without complaint. Mothers brought sick children and found care instead of turned backs. Old men with chronic pain received medicine that didn't cost more than they could afford. And though no one spoke his name aloud, everyone knew who funded these places, and more importantly, everyone knew why. One child had been healed by compassion, and that single act had rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water, the circles expanding far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Alessandro himself became quieter, more measured. His business continued. He was still a man of his world, still wielded power with precision. But something in him had softened. He spent more time with Lucia, teaching her not just about strength, but about responsibility. About the difference between ruling through fear and leading through respect. About how sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that didn't require anyone to lose. And Mira, she continued her life in the margins, working jobs that didn't pay enough, living in apartments that never quite felt like home. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the city held its breath between moments, she would feel it, a pull towards someone who needed help, a sense of cold places where life was flickering. She learned to trust that instinct, to follow it into hospital rooms and homeless shelters and anywhere else darkness gathered. She never asked for payment, never sought recognition. She simply touched people with hands that carried warmth like a gift freely given, and sometimes, not always but sometimes, they came back from the edge. Rumors spread about her, the mysterious girl who appeared when hope had been abandoned. Some called her an angel, others called her a witch, but the people she helped just called her blessed, and they were right in ways they couldn't fully understand. The night came many seasons later when Lucia, now older, wiser, carrying her own quiet strength, asked her father about the girl who'd saved her life. "Do you ever wonder where she is? If she's okay?" Alessandro sat in his study, older too, but carrying his years with more grace than he'd earned. "Every day," he admitted, "but I think she's exactly where she needs to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Because you let her go," Lucia said, understanding something profound about love and freedom, and the courage it takes to release what you want to keep. "Because I let her go," Alessandro agreed, "and because of that, she's still out there healing people, still making the world a little less cold. If I'd kept her here, locked her away to keep her safe, she would have lost the very thing that made her special." They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, both forever changed by a touch from a girl who'd had nothing but chose to give anyway. Somewhere in the city, under stars that shone through gaps in the clouds, Mira walked through streets that knew her name in whispers. She wore second-hand clothes and carried her belongings in a bag that had seen better days, but she moved with purpose and grace. Behind her, the windows of the free clinics glowed with warm light, filled with people receiving care they'd never dreamed possible. And ahead of her, the night held endless possibilities. Endless cold places that needed warming, endless darkness that needed someone brave enough to carry light into it. She'd been given a gift she didn't fully understand, born from compassion or heredity or simple human decency. But she understood what mattered, that every person she helped was someone's daughter, someone's father, someone's irreplaceable light in the world. And if a mafia boss's daughter was worth saving, then so was everyone else. The distinction between valuable and disposable was a lie people told themselves to sleep at night. Everyone was valuable. Everyone deserved to be pulled back from the dark, and Mira would spend her life proving that truth, one touch at a time. The city breathed around her, a living thing of concrete and steel and human stories layered like sediment over time. And in a mansion on the hillside, a little girl slept peacefully, kept warm not by machines or medicine, but by the memory of kindness. Her father sat watching over her, this man who'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that the greatest power comes not from what you can take or control, but from what you're brave enough to give away. The storm that had brought them all together had long since passed, but its effects remained, written in the architecture of how they chose to live, how they chose to love, how they chose to reach across the chasms that separated people and find common ground in shared humanity. And somewhere between the mansion and the shelters, between power and poverty, between the world as it was and the world as it could be, Mira disappeared into the crowd of evening pedestrians, unseen, unrecognized, but carrying within her the extraordinary truth that sometimes the most miraculous thing a person can do is simply care. The rest, as they say, is just details. The warmth remains, the light persists, and somewhere in the darkness, someone is always reaching out a hand to pull another soul back from the cold. That's the real miracle. That's the story that never ends.